Have you ever seen two relatives who, look alike, sound alike, and maybe even started out with the exact same goals in life, but somehow ended up on completely opposite sides of the family? Well, that's kind of what we're looking at today in the world of faith. We're diving into the pretty wild story of two movements that both tried to restore an ancient truth, but ended up creating two totally different worlds.
So let's just frame it with this question right here. What happens when two different faiths look at mainstream Christianity and say, you know what, something's broken here, and they both set out to fix it, only to end up as, well, theological strangers? That, right there, is the story of Mormonism and a much lesser-known restorationist faith called the Way.
I really like calling them estranged cousins of faith, because they really do come from the same family tree, a branch of religion we call restorationism. And they both started with this one super powerful, motivating goal: find and bring back a truth they were convinced was lost to history.
So, what exactly is restorationism? Well, the core belief is that sometime way back, after the original apostles, Christianity just went off the rails. It got corrupted. And the only way to fix it is to go all the way back, to restore the faith to what it was meant to be, its original pure form. This is ground zero for both Mormonism and the Way.
And you know what? They even agree on who the villain of the story is. They both look back at history and see this moment. The Way calls it the Constantinian shift, where this original spiritual movement got hijacked by empire. A faith that was all about your own radical agency became a tool for population control. They both see this corruption as a kind of imperial rust, and that's their common enemy.
Okay, so if they're fighting the same enemy, you'd think they'd have some things in common, right? And what's really fascinating is when you look close, you see just how much shared DNA there is. It's almost like Mormonism, in its own unique way, intuitively stumbled onto several core ideas that the Way also sees as absolutely central.
So from the Way's perspective, Mormonism actually got right a few huge things. First off, a flat-out rejection of the Trinity, seeing it as a later man-made idea. Second, a massive elevation of human potential, this idea that we're not just helpless sinners, but beings with some kind of divine spark. And third, a super rare focus on fixing this world, not just waiting for an escape hatch to the next one.
And this third point is so brilliantly illustrated right here. Both of these traditions have a really rare obsession with the ancient Book of Enoch. And because of that, they both see the endgame of history in a totally different light. It's not about abandoning a sinking ship. It's about building a city of light right here on Earth. Whether you call it Zion like they do in Mormonism or Fresh Shokorati, an ancient word for the final renovation of the world as it's known in the Way. All right, so they share a diagnosis of the problem, and they even share some of the proposed solutions. But this is where the family resemblance just stops. On the most fundamental questions of all, their paths just completely and dramatically diverge. Let's start with the biggest question there is. Who, or maybe what, is God? For Mormonism, God is an exalted man, a being with a body of flesh and bone. But for the Way, that's a huge mistake. They hold to this really strict monotheism, where God is the Ein Sof, a term that means without end, the infinite, uncreated, totally unimaginable source of all reality, the architect, not a character in the play. Okay, so what about Jesus? In Mormonism, he is Jehovah, the God of the Old Testament, who performs what's called a substitutionary atonement. He pays the price for our sin. The Way completely rejects that. To them, Jesus is the general, the first and the most perfect co-worker who didn't pay a debt for you, but showed you how to win the battle yourself. So let's just quickly run through this. God, an exalted man versus an infinite source. Jesus, a savior who is God versus a human general who is a template. Atonement, a debt that's paid for you versus a martyrdom you have to follow yourself. And humanity, gods in embryo versus active partners, or Kamkar, in creation. I mean, these are not small disagreements. We're talking about completely different spiritual universes. Now here's an absolutely crucial difference: historical evidence. See, the Way claims its lineage is rooted in verifiable history. They point to ancient texts like the Damascus document, which has been preserved for centuries as physical proof of a continuous resistance movement against that imperial corruption we talked about. And that documented lineage is a stark contrast to a restoration that's based on a much more recent revelation. And all of this brings us to the core critique that comes from the Way's perspective. It's this concept called the imperial trap.
And the question it raises is honestly kind of chilling. What if, in your big attempt to restore freedom, you accidentally build a brand new cage? So, what is the imperial trap? It's when a spiritual movement starts to look and act and organize itself just like the very empire it was trying to escape. Its focus shifts away from liberating the individual and onto ensuring the growth and stability of the institution itself. It's basically a replay of that original Constantinian shift. And an imperialized religion has some pretty clear signs. First, the believer is no longer a partner, but a subject who obeys. Second, the messenger gets turned into a divine spectacle that you just worship, not a human challenge that you have to follow. And third, the law becomes this rigid cage for controlling people, instead of personal armor for your own spiritual battle. And this, right here, is where the Way applies its critique directly to Mormonism. It looks at the centralized, top-down hierarchy with a prophet and a quorum of the 12 apostles and sees a recreation of a Roman or even a caliphate model. And that stands in absolute, stark opposition to the Way's core value, the radical, undeniable sovereignty of every single individual coworker. This quote from the source material it sums up the whole split perfectly. An empire needs subjects who obey. The Way needs coworkers who choose. It really is that simple. So let's bring it all home. After looking at their shared roots and their really deep disagreements, we get to two final, very distinct verdicts on these estranged cousins. It's one family, but they are headed for two completely different destinies. The final verdict on Mormonism, from this particular perspective, is that it did an amazing job restoring key parts of the ancient theology, but it ultimately failed the structural test. It took all those liberating ideas and wrapped them up in the familiar, controlling structure of an empire. And the verdict on the Way? Well, it's just the other side of that same coin. It argues that the only way you can truly restore the ancient theology is by restoring the ancient structure, or, the lack of structure. For them, the theology can only be pure when it's built on the absolute sovereignty of the individual. The freedom is the faith. And all of this leaves us with a final big question to think about. It's really the essential tension for any revolutionary movement, whether it's spiritual or political. Is it truly possible to restore an ancient, liberating faith without, at some point, building a new cage just to contain it?